prophets. And when I say that, a lot of people think, oh, that means he's not important. Well, that's not what the word minor means when you talk about prophets in the Old Testament. The word minor basically means that he was called for a specific message at a specific time. In other words, it wasn't like a lifetime of ministry for him. His particular message was given for a particular point in time, and then it was done. The major prophets had a message and kept getting new messages over a period of time. So you had like Elijah and Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Their ministry and their message changed and moved from event to event. However, prophets like Haggai and Malachi and Habakkuk was kind of a one message deal. It was God called them for a very specific time and place, and that was it. And once their message was done, they disappeared. And so that's why they're called minor prophets. It's nothing to do with them being unimportant. Okay, but the book of Haggai, if you're not real familiar with the Old Testament, go to the book of Malachi and work backwards, and you'll come across it. Technically, it is in the Old Testament. It is the very end of the Old Testament. There's 10 minor prophets. And so you need to understand the circumstances that get us to the book of Haggai. Haggai was at a time when Israel was in captivity. So, see, there used to be this guy named Solomon. King Solomon was the one who originally built the temple in Israel. And after his death, Judah turned away from God and began to worship foreign gods and idols. The northern kingdom fell first. That was the first, the other 10 tribes, which we call Israel. And their capital ended up being up Damascus. And then you had Judah. Judah was the 2 tribes, and they controlled Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the primary capital of Israel before they split. And Israel and Judah made up the 12 tribes. And so Benjamin and Judah were the 2 tribes that were in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem area. And so Jerusalem carried on after Israel fell for several years. And then we read in the book of Ezekiel how God's presence leaves the temple of Israel because they were carrying on sacrifices in the temple to other gods. They were pretending to follow the one true God, but it was all a show. They were having, they were worshiping Baal, and all that involved ritual sacrifice and religious prostitutes. Understand that Baal's religion, women, the priestess, practiced ritual prostitution as a way of incorporating Baal. So they were doing that in the temple. And God, basically warned them several times, and they refused. And in the book of Ezekiel, you'll see that God removes his presence from the temple. And then he removes his presence from Jerusalem. And then he brings the Babylonians, and they destroy Israel and raze it to the ground. They completely flatten it, and they destroy the temple, and it carries off the best and the brightest, because that's how Babylonian did. They would carry off the best to be trained in Babylon to be their leaders, to be governors and control the areas that they had conquered. And so that's where the book of Daniel takes place. That's all part of that captivity. And all of it because they refused to return their hearts back toward God. And one of the cautions that I will give you is that, I live in the United States, and I know not all of you do, but in my country, I have watched as my country has turned its back on God. It grieves me to know how hard they have been working to remove God from public life. They don't want him in government. They don't want him in schools. They don't want him in public life. And if you watch any American TV, you'll get the impression very quickly that all Christians are bumbling idiots and they're nothing but bigots. And it's not really what we believe, but it's how Hollywood likes to portray Christians. And so the world and America has really become a point where I really think we're at that same stage where God says, you know what, I'm removing my protection from you. I think that's what 9/11 was about. Was God trying to get our attention one last time and say, look, you need to turn back to me, because if you don't turn back to me, I'm going to remove my protection for you. I will protect my remnant, the believers that are still in the country, but the country itself has turned its back on me. You know, God's promise that he will always be there, that he says, I will, that I will never leave you, forsake you, is not meant to countries. It is aimed at his followers, at his people who have been saved. He says, we'll never be abandoned, and we'll never be left behind. But country has to earn God's protection by following him. And if it doesn't, God will remove his protection. And guys, Israel was God's chosen people. And when they sinned, he took their protection from them and allowed Babylon to conquer them. So if he'll do that to his chosen people, and America is not God's chosen land, if he'll do that to us, if he'll do that to them, can you imagine what he'll do to us? What he'll allow happen to us? You know, one thing that you will find in the book of Revelation, and I realize that I'm kind of wandering afield right now, but is that America is not mentioned in the book of Revelation. Period. We're not a major player. Obviously, there's a reason why America isn't mentioned, and it's because we're not a major player. Either we don't exist, or we're so minuscule and so unimportant that we don't have any part in the last days in terms of as a nation. So here we are. So the people of Judah, they're in captivity, and one day God raises up this prophet to inspire the people to get back to work. 14 years before Haggai, God arranges for a remnant, 50,000 people, to go back to Israel to rebuild the temple. That's what they were given permission. And so they go back and they get a good start. They're all excited. You know how it is when you first get involved in something. You're all excited about it. You're ready to go, and you start building, and they're just so enthusiastic about it. And then some hardships come, and some struggles come, and things get tough. And they say, well, it's too hard. Obviously, God doesn't want us to do this if we've got to struggle. If somebody oppresses us, then obviously it must not be God's will. And so we'll focus on building our own houses, and we'll leave God's temple alone. And so for 14 years, it says that they worked on building their paneled houses. Now, understand that word paneled, I always wondered what that meant, and I came across this in preparation for preaching this message. Panel just basically means that they were the best of the best. These were houses that were reserved for the very wealthiest of people. They had all the luxuries, hot and cold running water, and all that stuff. And I don't know, maybe a 2-camel garage, and I'm being silly, but the whole point is that they're the best of the best, and they're so focused on taking care of themselves and being luxurious that they lose sight of what they're there for. And so God sends Haggai, and Haggai comes to them and says, here you are. Why are you doing this? And so they started strong, and they built a foundation, and they built the altar, and the Samaritans opposed them, and they panicked. Oh, we can't do this. And then Haggai comes up and says, the time is now. The time is now to build my temple. And so they started again, and they became incredibly discouraged after about a month. They finally get some back on work. God's got to give them the special plan, and we talked about this kind of jokingly, but God gives them 3 steps. This is your 3 steps to building the temple. Go get the wood, or go in the mountains, get the wood, come back down, build the temple. Real complicated, right? Real complex plan. And like us, we would have been like, oh, God, I need to know who's doing the permits and who's buying this. And, no, God says, look, go up in the mountains, get the wood, come back down, build the temple. And they start building, and they get all discouraged because the temple is taking too long. After a month, they're worried that the temple isn't finished yet, and they're starting to compare it to the original one. Oh, no, look, this is not anywhere near like the old one. We just want to give up. I mean, oh, poor, woe is me. And trying to do, and if they look at their attitude, you can find that many of them really battled the same battle that many of us feel when we think we're trying to do something, and we ask that God asks us to do, but things just aren't going well. We're trying to do what you told us to, God, and yet we're not making progress. We're trying to obey you, and yet our life is still not what we thought it would be. It's not working. You almost feel the cry of our hearts. God, we're obeying you, and yet where are you? Where are the results? It's been a whole month. Why haven't you finished this yet? And God tells them, what? Be strong and do the work. Hey, guess what, guys? Be strong. Don't be discouraged. Be strong in me and do the work. Now, you're thinking, well, what does that got to do? Well, understand something. Be strong in me. In other words, be strong in the Lord. Allow God to provide you strength. When I am weak, He is strong. He increases as I decrease. And just do what He's called you to do. We struggle with that in America because we want instant gratification. We have instant microwaves and instant pizza and instant popcorn. And we think that we should be able to just snap our fingers and everything's perfect. God, I want patience and give it to me now. Right this second. Not take time to build it into me, which is how He does it. We want instant mashed potatoes instead of waiting for the real thing. And that was part of their problem. They're a month in, and they want to give up. They're so discouraged because it's just not happening fast enough. We've been building this whole temple, and there's 50,000 of us, and that doesn't mean everybody here is building because, it's wife and children. It's not like they went and just them in. Otherwise they wouldn't have needed to build houses. So their families are there. So we've got 50,000 people, including wives and children, to build the temple. And they've been at it a whole month. And they can't figure out why it's not happening fast enough. And they want it to be just like the original temple of Solomon. And God says, look, guys, you do what you're required to do. You do the work. You be faithful. And I'll take care of the results. Okay? I'll take care of the rest of it. But your job is to do the work. And see, the reality is that Solomon spent years having the temple built. And he had the best contractors and the best workers, and he had people donating gold and silver and all sorts of things to build the temple. And it took years. So why they expected that, here they are with 50,000 people total, to rebuild a temple in the wilderness is absolutely amazing. That they would get discouraged, but that's what happens. And so that brings us kind of to this week. And it's kind of the problem we all struggle with. Is it worth obeying God in this area? Because it's just not happening the way I want it to. I think all of us at one point or another in our walk have battled with it. Some of us may be battling it now. Chances are it's a problem that many of you have even struggled with. And I call the problem conditional obedience to God. Okay, God, I'm in as long as you deliver. I will obey you as long as you give me what I want. God, I'll obey as long as it doesn't cost me anything. I'll do it as long as I see the results I want to see. But if it makes me uncomfortable, if it causes me to walk outside my comfort zone, if it's inconvenient or you're not doing it as fast as I think you should, God, I'm going to pull back and I'm going to withhold my obedience. I'll obey as long as it doesn't make me uncomfortable or I see the results I want to see. That is conditional obedience. Perfect example. Some of you know that in my other incarnation, I'm a teacher. I work for the Martin County School District. I'm bivocational pastor, which means I serve as a pastor and I work a full-time job. And as a teacher, I get to see that played out with students all the time. Well, if we're not getting a grade for taking these notes, then why should I take them? Because you'll need them to take the test, or you've got to point out. But if they don't see a benefit in it for themselves, they don't want to do it. There isn't a mentality that says, well, I'll help you because you need help. No, what's in it for me? And we live in a world that says, what's in it for me? I don't want to do it unless there's something in it for me. I don't want to serve God. I don't want to obey God unless I get some kind of benefit from it. I think that's one of the reasons that so many people believe that the primary purpose of salvation is so we get to go to heaven. Okay, that's what's in it for me. That's the golden ticket for me. That's the golden e-ride at Disney World. Sorry, you guys probably don't know what that means. I've been around a really long time, and Disney used to have what they call e-tickets. That was that got you into any ride. You had A tickets, B tickets, C tickets, D tickets, and E tickets, and you got a book of tickets when you checked in, and then you put in the ticket when you went to the... Now, they don't do that anymore. You buy a pass when you get in, and it takes you into everything. But we had old e-tickets, and so you use the e-ticket to get into Disney World. Now, when you live in Florida, Disney World is something that's, that you're just familiar with. And I've lived here since I was 13 years old, and I'm ancient. And so, I'm familiar with the old days when we had e-tickets and all that other stuff. So, but that's what we want. We want the prize. We want to benefit from serving Him. And so our obedience to what He calls us to do is conditional upon Him delivering. Well, God, if you don't do this the way I want you to do, I'm not obeying you. I'm going to do my own thing. Because what's in it for me? What's in it for me to accept you as Savior and Lord? What's in it? What am I going to get out of this? How does it benefit me? I think the other side to us is that we have selective hearing. And you guys know what that is. Anybody who's a parent knows what selective hearing is about. Selective listening. Hey kids, come out here and help me do the laundry. Call that out and you won't see your kids at all. No, Mom, I didn't hear you. I was in my room, I was listening to a radio, I didn't hear you yell for me, I'm sorry. Hey son, could you take out the garbage? I'll be back later, Mom, I'm going to the store. But I asked you to... I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Stand in your kitchen and under your breath say, ice cream. And every child will develop super hearing. They will hear that. Or pizza. You don't have to yell that loud because they'll hear it. It's selective listening. And we do the same thing to God. In the very same way, we do that to God. I love that part, God, about the whole many plans in your heart to bless us and to prosper us and not to harm us and to give us hope and a future. And I love that verse of God about forgive my enemies. No way. I'm not listening to that. You don't know my enemies. I'm not forgiving my enemies. I have a hard time forgiving my friends. I hate my enemies. Oh, okay, God. You say pray for my enemies. Yeah, I can do that, God. I want you to pray that you'll drop a rock on them and all the bad stuff in the world will happen to them, I'll pray for them that way, God. How's that? And I'm not doing that. And that's selective listening. I'll take the one part but not the other. God works all things together for good, and we stop right there. All right, God's going to work all things together for good. And when it doesn't work out that way, we get mad because we think God didn't tell us everything, but we forget the rest of the verse. All things are good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Okay. Oh, no, God, I love that verse about you're doing everything for good for me, but you got to understand, God, you have no idea what it's like. You don't understand my needs. I'm not doing that, God. Forget that. No. It's selective listening. It's selective. I'll obey as long as I'm comfortable. It's conditional obedience. But we need to understand that this text is about to get really, really serious here in a moment. And is that God does not give us options to consider. God does not say, well, here are your options. You obey me, and this and this and this positive will happen. He's saying you will obey. In fact, the word in the New Testament says that if you are my disciples, you will obey me. If you love me, you obey me. If you don't love me, you don't obey me. There's not options there. God doesn't say, well, you love me a little, and so you obey me some. He says, if you love me, you will obey me. Period. Not your options are this. This is your choices. And your degree of love is based on the level of obedience. No. You obey me if you love me. If you're going to be my disciples, you will obey me. Period. There's no extra attitude there. God does not give us options to consider, but commands to obey. And we're going to see God show very clearly to the people the corruptive power of sin. That's what Haggai does. If you remember earlier, God's people turned away from God and they worshipped idols. And their hearts were not with God. And they put their own houses ahead of God's house. And so God tells Haggai the prophet to ask the priest some questions. Now, let me say these questions sound a little weird at first. And I'm going to unweird them for you in just a minute. But let's get there. So, Haggai verse 12, verse 12, chapter 2. Haggai says to the priest, if one of you is carrying some meat from a holy sacrifice in his robes, and you're like, what? Wait, whoa. Did I just read that? Yeah, stop here. You're probably going now, what does that mean? Well, just so you know, the priest, when they were going to do the sacrifice, they would always wear their robes, and they would take the holy or sanctified meat, and they would take the robes and fold it up into a little packet to keep the meat. And when Haggai's going to ask is if your robe, which is kind of like touching something holy, brushes up against something that is unholy, does the holiness rub off on the unholiness? And the holiness becomes holy. And that's what he's going to ask him. He says, if one of you is carrying some meat from a holy sacrifice in his robe, and his robe happens to brush against some bread or stew or wine or olive oil or any other kind of food, will it also be holy? And the priest says, well, no. In other words, the holiness doesn't rub off. It's like this. Modern example. I clean my hands, right? They're nice and clean. I've gone, used soap and everything. There's nothing under the nails. I've got really clean hands. And then I pick up a plate off the table. It's got spaghetti sauce on it because we had dinner before I went and washed my hands. And I'm going to put the plate in the trash. And so I pick it up. My hands are clean. Does the plate become clean when I touch it because my hands are clean? That's silly, right? We think, oh, no, wait a minute. No, that's not right. The plate doesn't suddenly become clean because my hands are clean. And that's really what he's saying, is that you have something that's holy, that's set apart for God, and that's what holy means. It means sanctified or set apart for his purposes. And you touch something unholy with it, the unholy thing does not become holy because it touched the holy thing. Now he goes to the other side here because in verse 13, he illustrates the principle this way. If someone becomes unclean You touch a dead person and now they're unclean. That makes you unclean. Then if that person touches any of these foods, will they be defiled? The priest actually answers him and says, yes, it is. Basically showing that sin is a disease. It spreads. Sin spreads faster than holiness. It's the corruptive power of sin. Paul says it this way in the New Testament. Bad company corrupts good character. Bad company corrupts good character. He didn't say good company cleans bad character. He says that there's the corruptive power of sin. You could say that sin is like spaghetti sauce on the plate. If I've got clean hands and I pick up the plate and I put my hand, stick my thumb in the middle of spaghetti sauce, what happens? My hand gets dirty again. I just cleaned it, but now it's got spaghetti sauce on it. It stains everything it touches. This is where the text gets tough. Verse 14. So Haggai responds, and this is how it is with this people and this nation, says the Lord. Everything they do and everything they offer is defiled by their sin. Okay? This is a challenge because they turned away, because their hearts are going after idols and not after me. Because of that, God says everything they do, I don't care how good it is, I don't know how wonderful it is, everything they offer is defiled by their sin. We could say it this way. When your heart isn't right with God, when your heart isn't right with God, everything you do will be wrong. And I hear you pushing back, and I don't know about that. I don't know about that. Okay, jump to the New Testament, and Jesus says this. If you're going to go to church one day and you want to give an offering, you're going up to the altar to give an offering, but first you realize that you have something in your heart against someone else. First, leave your gift there at the altar, go and make your relationship right. Get your heart right, then come back and give your gift. Because if your heart is not right, it doesn't matter what you do. Everything you do is wrong. Parents, you know this. One kid does something wrong to another kid, so what do? You make the kids apologize to each other. And so the kid comes in and says, sorry. And you can say, no, you didn't mean that. Okay? That doesn't count. Right thing, wrong heart does not count. Go up and say it like you mean it. Sorry. No, not quite. You've got to really mean it. This time, say you're sorry and give him a hug. And I'm going to tell you a little secret. When I was growing up, if that didn't work, Mom would make me kiss my sister. That was the fate worse than death. When I was 5, if you did something and you got into a fight with your sister, okay, Mom would say, okay, tell your sister you're sorry and give her a kiss. No, Mom, no! I remember that. Oh, it was horrible. I still have nightmares about it. And I'm 55 years old. No, I'm kidding. But the point is that doing the right thing with the wrong heart isn't right. It doesn't make it right. Because what God looks at is the heart, is your character, is your nature, not the activities. And if you do the wrong thing, you do the right thing, but you're still in rebellion to God, it's still rebellion. Everything you do outside of God is sin, folks. Everything. There is no such other thing. If you're not a believer, everything you do is sin. I don't care how good a person you are. I don't care whether you donate trillions of dollars to the poor and needy every year. Okay? If you're a sinner, if you are not saved, everything you do is sin. I don't care how good or bad it is. God does not judge it based on the merit of the activity, but on the condition of the heart. Attitude matters. If your heart isn't right, then whatever you do is completely wrong. So what do we see so often? Oh God, I'll obey you. I'll obey you as long as you do what I want you to do. I'll obey you as long as this is working out. I'll obey you as long as it doesn't cost me anything. Isn't too inconvenient. I'll give you a $5 obedience, but not a $100 obedience. Now, what I mean by that is this. When I was a lot younger, and I was at Publix in the grocery store. That's a grocery store in Florida, in case you don't know. And I'm standing there in line, and this little old lady's in front of me, and she's practically in tears because She'd bought all this food, and she was $5 short, and she was trying to figure out what staple she had to put back so that she could pay her bill. And I felt a little nudge from God and says, help her. And so I got the cashier's attention, and I showed her the $5 bill and said, I'll take care of it. I didn't want the old lady, I didn't really feel like the old lady needed to know. And cashier kind of looked at me funny, but okay. And so they added the $5 onto my account, and I paid it. And the little old lady got her groceries. She went home. Didn't matter. I wasn't looking for somebody to say, "Oh, what a wonderful human being you are," or anything like that. I wasn't after that. It just felt like that's what God wanted me to help somebody. That was easy. That's $5 obedience. It didn't really cost me that much. Okay, I still got to help somebody, and it really felt like I obeyed what God told me to do. Now let me make it a more difficult situation. This didn't happen. But I'm in the same grocery store, and the lady's in front of me, right? And I've got $150 in cash on me, and I'm buying groceries for me. Now, I bought some extra stuff, but I don't have a lot of waste in there, you know. And the little old lady comes up $100 short, and she doesn't have enough, and she's feeding, and she's not a little old lady this time. She's a young mother with 3 kids, and her kids are looking at her like, we're going to starve to death if we don't have these groceries. And God nudges me and says, give them all you have. That's $100 obedience. And see, that's where I'm afraid I would struggle. Well, God, you don't understand. If I don't have food, I'm going to starve to death. Well, what does that say? Is I don't trust God to take care of me. I'm not willing to sacrificially give. It's the same reason a lot of us don't tithe. And I'm not asking for you to tithe to Grace Baptist, but I'm talking about in the real life. You tithe not because, number one, God needs the money. God is not sitting up in heaven saying, well, I wonder how we're going to pay this bill. They're going to turn the electricity off to heaven if I don't get the electric bill paid. It's not happening. God is the creator of all things. He owns all things. So why does he want you to tithe? Well, he wants you to tithe because, number one, it's an act of worship. It's saying, God, I've committed to you. This is me giving back to you what you gave to me. And that's all we're doing with tithing. It's God providing, and all we're doing is returning some of it to say, God, we trust you. It's demonstrating our trust in him and our faith in him. Okay? So tithing isn't about us, God, needing the money. If God wants something to happen, he doesn't need your help to make it happen. But he wants you to experience that act of worship and that act of faith that says, God, even though I can't afford this, I'm going to surrender to you. That's $100 obedience or $1,000 obedience. Maybe, he calls you to give up everything and go to Somalia. And you sacrifice your job and everything to go to Somalia to proclaim the gospel, knowing that proclaiming the gospel in Somalia is illegal. And it might get you killed. And you might end up dying for your faith. What happened to the early disciples, with the exception of John, who ended up on the island of Patmos, all of the other disciples were killed for their proclamation of the gospel. Even the guy we call Doubting Thomas. He ended up in India proclaiming the gospel. Started several churches. In fact, there are churches in India, even today, that use a liturgy in Aramaic that can trace their founding all the way back to Thomas, Doubting Thomas. Thomas was eventually speared to death for proclaiming the gospel. You know that Peter was crucified upside down. Every other disciple was killed for their faith. That's called unconditional obedience. God, I'm going to serve you no matter what it costs me. I'm going to obey you no matter how inconvenient it is. No matter how hard it is. I want to show you that I love you. I don't obey to earn my salvation. I obey to show you I love you. We need to understand that we do not only obey God so that he will obey us, so that he will bless us. We obey God because we love him. It's all about the heart. Okay? We do not obey God for what he's going to do for us, so that he'll make our lives better. We obey God because of who he is, and we obey him because we love him, and we want to honor him with everything in us. And this is why getting our hearts right matters so much. If you think it's been challenging so far, you haven't seen anything yet. God reminds his people he's going to get down to the heart of the matter. So he reminds his people in Haggai 2, verse 15. He says, look at what's happening to you before you lay in the foundation of the Lord's temple. Okay? If you're here at week number 1, you remember we talked about how they built the foundation and go up in the mountains and get the wood and come back and build it. And we talked about how they were so empty. You know, here they are. They're in there, and they just don't get it. They don't understand why everything that they've done to please themselves, the new homes, is just not satisfying them. He reminds these people in Haggai verse 15, chapter 2, look at what's happening to you. You begin the foundation. Before they laid the foundations, we looked at that verse so many people identified with. Hey, you're drinking, but you're not thirsty. You're still thirsty. You're eating, but you're not full. You're putting your money in your pockets with holes in it. In other words, you're doing everything you can to have meaning in this life, but you're still empty. You're still accumulating so much wealth and things and having as much fun as you can. You still feel like there's something more. You're consuming everything you can, and yet there's not enough left over. You're working your tail off, and you're not getting ahead. What's going on with this? He said, you remember that? Before you built the tent foundation, that's where you were? In verse 16, he says, when you hope for a 20 bushel crop, and you harvested only 10, okay, you thought you were going to get paid $20 an hour, and when your paycheck came in, it was half of that. And then he says, when you expected to draw 50 gallons from the press, but you found only 20, okay, you're not doing everything you could. You're doing everything you could, and yet just not simply couldn't get ahead. And then God says this, and people freak out when you hear this. Verse 17, I sent blight and mildew and hail to destroy everything you worked so hard to produce. Oh, ouch, God. You're working our buns off. We're working our buns off, and I sent blight and hail and mildew, and the reason you don't get ahead is because I don't let you. Now, if I'm honest, I don't like that picture of God. That disturbs me. And can I say that? And, I don't. I'm doing all this. I'm trying my best. And you, God, you sent these things to keep me from having any crops. Is it worth it? Why in the world would a good God stop us from having provision when we're doing everything we can just to survive? What kind of God is that? Is that a God that I want to serve? Is that a God that truly loves me? Why would God do that? And the rest of the verse tells us is this. I sent blight and mildew and hail to destroy everything you worked so hard to produce. And then God says, even so, you refuse to return to me, says the Lord. You see, God is not trying to punish his people. God is trying to restore them. And that's his goal. God was not trying to punish them. He was simply trying to bring them back. Several months ago, I talked about a phrase that you'll hear in the mountains of North Carolina where I was born. And I'm hesitant to use it because I've got a brother here. He's not here this morning, so I can get away with it. I got a brother who absolutely loves the phrase, and he will work it into any conversation. I think it's his new favorite word. Man. When you have a donkey in the mountains, in the hillbillies, and that donkey won't work, he is so stubborn, and you've got to hit him upside the head with something to get his attention, to get him to listen to you, we call that slab-sided. And I am afraid that a lot of us, when God says, you need to do this, we're slab-sided. And God's got to hit us upside the head with something to say, pay attention, this is for your good, I'm trying to change you. All the items that you worried about, the crops and the wealth and the money and all the stuff you think you earn, guess what, guys? I want your attention. I am more interested in changing your character and your heart than I am in giving you stuff. And so we're slab-sided, and so God's kind of come along and basically hit us upside the head with a 2x4 and say, listen to me, because this is for what's best for you. God's not doing it to be mean. God's doing it to draw us back to Him, to get our attention. And we're going, we're walking along, singing our little tune, and all this other strange stuff, and we're not paying attention whatsoever. So God allows something bad with a purpose to get our attention and draw our hearts back. Perfect example in my country. America has abandoned God, right? America's turned its back on God. You know, after 9/11, there were more people in church seeking God than had been in 20 years. God took His protection away. We were attacked. People died. People were afraid. And they turned back to God. Unfortunately, they didn't stay that way, but that's the point. He allowed something to happen to get our attention. Did He kill all those people? No, He doesn't say that. He said He drew His protection, and basically all that stuff that happened to the Israelites would have happened anyway. You get hail and blight and mildew. But God's saying, I withdrew my protection of your crops so that they would fall. Because I wanted your attention. I allowed hail to come. Did I strike it down on purpose? No, I allowed the natural course of events to occur. That's all God's telling them. I was protecting you and you abandoned me, and so I'm going to withdraw my protection. That's why Jerusalem was stood for so long. It's because God protected it. But when God withdrew His protection, Babylon leveled it. And these people need to understand that if you're going to say, I'm going to obey you when it's good for me, then God's going to say, I'm going to withdraw my protection from you. Other times, and understand something, just because something bad happens to you does not mean that God is trying to get your attention. Sometimes it really is, there's a spiritual war going on. We have an enemy out there who hates us. When you became a believer, you gained two enemies, the world and Satan. And he hates believers. And if you're making an impact for Christ, there's going to be opposition that comes up. I always get a kick out of when I get trolls in here. You know why? Because it tells me that I'm making an impact somewhere. That tells me that God is using this ministry for something. See, what troll tells me is that, you know, somebody's opposing me, somebody's attacking, tells me that, guess what? You're doing something right. You're being obedient, and God's taking care of the results. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not fun. I don't really encourage trolls to come here. I'm not hired a troll to come in and visit us. All I'm saying is that when opposition rises up in ministry, it's usually a sign that you're doing what God called you to do. But there are times when our hearts are turned away from God, that God allows, or maybe even causes something with the intention of getting our hearts back to Him. And what's really loving to me is that what God, all He did was cut off their supply. Notice He didn't make them sick, He didn't kill their kids, He didn't do something cruel. He just cut off their protection. Basically to get their attention, to turn them back to Him. Oh yeah, God, You're our provider. You're the one that controls the seasons. We need You, God, and our hearts are coming back to You. This seems unloving for a moment. Remember, if you're a loving parent, you did the same thing to your rebellious kid. You got a kid off at college, and word gets back to you that all that money you're sending them to go to school, they're not going to class. They haven't been to class all semester. All they're doing is partying all the time, and they're wasting all your money on wine, women, and song, and or whatever, and they're not doing anything in school. Are you going to continue to give them money to go to school? Continue to try to pay their bills? No! You're going to say, if you're not using this properly, I'm taking it away from you. Parents, you do that. I have a buddy of mine that I grew up with. His family is really well off. Well, they were. Um, I'm not sure they still are, but that's beside the point. Anyway, he was one of those kids where Dad bought him a new car all the time. He went through. I mean, when the time we were 18, 16, he went through 5 cars. He wrecked all of them, and then his dad took his car away. But I can't help but wonder if Dad had said, "You know what? First time you misused it, it's mine. I revoke your insurance. I'm not paying it. I'm not, and you can't have a driver's license with insurance in Florida, and so I'm taking your car." And if that would have been more loving, because God says, "I'm more interested in your character." And if God is disciplining you, that means you're His. You don't discipline other people's kids. Not even as a teacher am I allowed to discipline students. Not in that way. You know, our biggest discipline? Call the mom. So-and-so is skipping class. You call the parents in. You have a conference. Well, so-and-so is going to get expelled if he doesn't come to school. And in Florida, if you're a dropout and you're not 18, if you don't finish school and you turn 18, and before you even turn 18, you leave, the state of Florida has this nice little law where they take your driver's license and they revoke it until you turn 21. And so that's kind of a nice stick we use to make sure they stay in school. And it's sort of what God does to us. God says, "You know what? I withdraw my protection until you return to me." And so God says one simple message. In this text above all else, God says more than anything else, I want your heart. More than anything else, I'm not interested in the physical. I'm not interested in the buildings and all the materialistic stuff that you think is so important. I want you. I want you to seek me with all your heart. You used to love me, but God says you can't make me second. I'm not sharing the throne of your heart with another person, with another thing. You know, we talked about a couple months ago. We did a series called Gods at War, based on some material from Kyle Idleman. And one of the things in the book that it talks about is that a lot of us put in a love seat. You know, we've got God in the love suit, and we've added something else that's equal to God in our hearts, and that's in control. Well, God, you're in control of that area, but my car's in control of this, or my family's in control of this, or my job's in control of this, and you don't have any control in that area. I'll give you the rest of me, but you can't have all of me. And God says, I don't want just part of you. I have to have all of you. I want all of your heart. But now you've turned away and you've worshipped other idols, and I want your heart. I want all of you. I want to be first in everything. Matthew 6:33, Jesus says this, seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and then all these things shall be added to you. I want you to delight in me, to enjoy me, to seek me, delight in me, and then I will give you the desires of your heart. But first you delight in me. I want you to pursue me with all of your heart. And when you seek God with all your heart, He says, you will find me. I want you to put me above all else. In the New Testament, Jesus said there is one command above others, and that is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. It's all about the heart. If your heart isn't right with God, then everything else you do is wrong. And when your heart is right with God, you'll see Him start to bless you. But it's not about the blessing. It's about your heart. It's about God transforming you. God's not saying, I want you not to have a nice house, but don't put your house ahead of Him. God's not saying, I want you to have a cruddy job because are you to enjoy your work? I'm not saying that at all. He's saying, I want to be everything through which you filter everything else. Your relationship with your family, your relationship with your mom and dad, your relationship with your wife and kids, all of that, God wants to be the focus through which you filter everything. God isn't going my way. But God, is it worth it? But God, God. And we don't obey, so God will bless. We obey God because we love Him. The blessings are simply a side effect. And that's why we do what we do is so important. That's why corporate worship together, where we come together in the church and we corporately worship God, we're saying, God, we love you with all our hearts. We hear His word together, and this is what this matters, and that's why we have we do Bible studies and small groups, because the pull of the world is so strong, and we gather together to build each other up, to encourage each other, to be a body. God, we want to do the life around your word in community. And that's one reason why the tithe matters. We talked about that. You're worshiping God. As you bring increase, I choose in my heart to put you first, God, and to worship you. God, I seek you with all that I have, all that I am, all that I think is important. The beauty of this whole thing is that God got their hearts. Not only were they building the temple where they were obeying, but God had their hearts. And because their hearts came back to God, so did God's blessings. Not because they obeyed, but because their hearts were right with Him. And that's an amazing part of the story. In Haggai 2, verse 15, God says to them, even though they hadn't finished the temple, even though they didn't do anything to deserve it, only because their hearts had changed, God said, I am giving you a promise now. Now's the time to build the temple. Now's the time to get your hearts right with God. Now's the time to repent of sin that you have rationalized or justified. Now's the time to stop giving God lip service and not giving your heart. Now's the time not to put your house first, but to put His house first. Now is the time. And God says, I give you this promise. While the seed is still in the barn, you have not yet harvested your grain and your grapevines and your fig leaves, your fig trees and your pomegranates, and your olive trees have not yet produced their fruit. In other words, you still got planting to do. It's not even harvest time. But from this day onward, I will bless you. Even though you did not plant the seed, I promise that you will have a harvest, a blessing. Because you built the not because you built the temple, but because you gave me your heart. Above all else, God says, I want your heart. And there are those of you that if you're really honest, God is going to do a miracle in you, and no one may see it from the outside. But the one thing's going to happen is on the inside. It's going to take your heart. You may be obeying outwardly. You may be going through all the motions, but you're rebellious or discontent. And no more lip service. No more playing at it. We will give Him our whole hearts, and we will not obey God so He will bless us. We obey God because we love Him with all our hearts, mind, soul, and strength. And this is where we are today, returning our hearts back to fully worshiping God. Join with me as we close in prayer. Father,